you for joining us on this Monday night. I'm very, very, very excited to be in conversation with Ramie. Not least of all because, as I was telling you, I'm working on an introduction to a new edition of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and you derive the title for this book from A Room of One's Own, and particularly from Woolf's imagination of Shakespeare's sister Judith. So I wonder if you could just start by talking about how Woolf's understanding of Shakespeare's non-existent sisters inspired your writing of this book.
Absolutely. So thank you, Merve, for being here with me in conversation. Before I answer that, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I have so many friends and beloved family members, and my wonderful editor, Deb Garrison, is here, who made this book possible, and thanks to Rizzoli for hosting me. I mentioned this, but I just have to say it, I grew up with a grandmother who used to take me to the Rizzoli on West 57th Street as my birthday present to buy books. That tells you what kind of a child I was. But as my nieces and nephews here will know, I get made fun of for this kind of thing. But anyway, so being here to launch the book is very special to me. So about Virginia Woolf and A Room of One's Own, in a lot of ways, the whole book came out of my engagement with that text. So for those of you who either haven't read or haven't read in a while, very briefly, Virginia Woolf talks in A Room of One's Own, which came out of a set of lectures she gave in 1928, about how absolutely impossible it would have been for a woman to be a writer in Shakespeare's England. And she does this by way of conjuring up an imaginary sister of Shakespeare, and she says, if Shakespeare had a sister, let's call her Judith, who had the talent that Shakespeare had, she would have gone mad. She would have had a twisted and deranged imagination. She would have been impoverished. She would have been a witch. And she goes on this long, really extravagant riff and gets more and more animated about how impossible it would have been. And that's what I was taught as an undergraduate in the late 1980s, as a graduate student in the 1990s. That was my vision as a student of Renaissance literature of why I wasn't reading any women. That was the explanation that was given to me, and I'm embarrassed about this, but I never questioned it. So it never crossed my mind that maybe this wasn't true, that maybe there were women who got lost. It wasn't part of that generation's set of questions. So my title comes from that, and I make it plural because it turns out that Virginia Woolf was wrong. There were women writing. She was right about how difficult it was, and she was right about all the obstacles that they had to overcome. But there were not like 35, but I write about 4, and there are a few others. There were women who managed to write and to be sane and to have relatively normal lives.
You talk at the very end of the book, or you yourself conjure this wonderful scene at the end of the book about being an undergraduate at Yale in the late 80s, and reading A Room of One's Own, and then being a graduate student at Berkeley after that, and still not encountering the women that you write about in this book. So I wonder if you could recall for us what your first encounter was, either with these 4 women or with any other early modern woman writer who kind of clued you in to the existence of Shakespeare's sisters.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I have a clear answer because after I finished my PhD in Renaissance English literature in 1996, I came back to Yale as a junior faculty member, and I was teaching a class on 17th century poetry, and a male colleague of mine, someone that we both know, John Rogers, said to me, there's a new edition out of this woman poet from the period, Amelia Lanyer. Have you ever heard of her? And I had never heard of her. And so I got this book, and I was blown away by it, and we can talk about it a little bit. But I introduced it into my syllabus, and that turns out to have been the first time a Renaissance woman was ever taught at Yale, according to the Yale Blue Books, the Yale curriculum, because when I was researching this book, I got all the archives. So that was my first encounter.
Do you want to read a little bit of Amelia Lanyer's poetry for those who are unfamiliar with her? I do have a page ready. Yes,
let's see if it's the same thing that I would read.
Is that what you would read?
I would go maybe one page more.
Go ahead.
or two. Let me see if I can find it. But yeah. So what I wanted to find, yes, here we are. So Amelia Lanyer is one of the 4 women in the book, and she's in some ways the most surprising. The other 3 are either, 2 of them are aristocrats. One was born into the daughter of a very wealthy lawyer. Amelia Lanyer is the daughter of an Italian immigrant, probably of Jewish origins from Venice, who came over to be a musician at the court of Henry VIII. Her mother was illiterate. She signed her name with an X. And yet this woman went on to be the first woman to write a book of poetry in 17th century England, with no less a very fancy Latin title, which she said came to her in her sleep. So that's who we're dealing with here. And in the central poem of her book of poems, she makes a really, it's not even proto-feminist, I don't want you to think, it's a feminist argument for why women and men should be equal. And she does this through a very minor character in the Bible, Pontius Pilate's, the governor of Judea's wife, who gets one line in one gospel. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Pontius Pilate's wife, who doesn't even have a name, says, "Do not harm that just man," referring to Christ, "because I've had a dream about this." And Amelia Lanyer plucks that character from total obscurity and makes her the heroine of her poem. And so in her mouth, she starts criticizing what her husband is about to do and saying, this is so much worse than what Eve did. Doesn't compare. Eve's crime, Eve was innocent. She didn't really know what she was doing. So she says that if unjustly you condemn Christ to die, then let us, meaning women, then let us have our liberty again, and challenge to yourselves no sovereignty. You came not in the world without our pain of childbirth. Make that a bar against your cruelty. Your fault, you men, your fault being greater, why should you disdain our being your equals, free from tyranny? If one weak woman, Eve, simply did offend, this sin of yours hath no excuse nor end. Imagine saying such a thing in 1611. So, she's really quite extraordinary.
And this is what happens when husbands don't listen to their wives.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
That's right.
Right. So and actually, let's start with her and go through each of your women one by one. As you said, she is in some ways the most surprising case study in this because she does not belong to the aristocracy. She comes from a family that has no traffic with literature or even with literacy. And as you write, the records that we have of her come to us from a kind of skeevy astrologer that she used to visit, right? So this is a woman who really defies every kind of structural condition that has been put in her way. How? Yeah. How does this happen? I mean, it's an extraordinary story.
And it's a little bit like, how did Shakespeare come to write all of his plays? Meaning, it's actually created a lot of crazy theories about her and what happened to her, because it is so hard to explain. But what we do know about Amelia Lanyer's childhood comes, as Merve said, from an astrologer whom she visited. And he was also a medical practitioner. He was kind of a quack. So she went to see him for 2 reasons, because she thought she was having a miscarriage and she wanted him to check the pregnancy, and she was having a miscarriage. And she also wanted to know, on the side, if she was going to become a lady, if she was going to rise socially. And so they met on a number of occasions over a period of around 6 months, pretty regularly, the way we would talk to a therapist, and he took notes. And so everything we're learning about her personal life is coming through this, as you say, very compromised source, and yet it's all we have. So what we learn from him is that Amelia Lanyer, when her father died and she was 5, was sent off, or soon after, to the household of the Countess of Kent. So here we have this girl living in a poor neighborhood in London with an illiterate mother, with an Italian father who's just died. They have no particular access to power. And somehow she managed to get into the household of one of, you know, the most aristocratic women in the country, who seems to have educated her. And the evidence we have for that, besides these notes from the astrologer saying that she was brought up by the Countess of Kent, the evidence we have is that in one of the poems that she writes, the dedicatory poems to that book of her important book of poetry, she writes a dedication to the Countess of Kent. And she thanks her for having civilized her, for having taught her manners and civility. And so there's a strong class message there. But it seems she must have also learned, you know, not just to read, but she was super, super literate. She wrote an 1,800-line poem in terza rima, Dante's form. So this was not a minor education.
Yeah, you know, the way that you describe that raises a separate kind of question, which is the archives that we have of these women are so patchy in places. And as you said, they have been inscribed by compromised sources. How does the literary historian work with patchy or compromised archives? To what degree do you kind of mobilize other strategies, and in particular imaginative strategies, for trying to tell a story where the historical record can feel quite frustrating in its silences?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's very true working on women's history and on other underrepresented groups. I teach a class on witchcraft and magic.
How to be a witch?
No, unfortunately, I lose a couple of students always on the first day. They look dejected when they realize that's not what I'm doing. But when I'm working on the witchcraft archives, we have a really extreme version of what you're saying, where you only hear the voice of the lawyer, of the trial record. We never, and to the extent that the women are represented, it's coming through that. So we really do have to do a lot of, as you say, sort of putting things together, supposition. It's not easy. One of the ways that with Amelia Lanyer I sort of verified things, as I say, is to try to find in her poems some corroboration of things that Simon Foreman said. You know, so that you try to combine things even if they're not directly related. You look, you know, in this case at all the dedicatory poems, that helps you. But you know, besides the records of the astrologer, we have several lawsuits that she ended up filing because she was she was a great user of the legal system. So women couldn't sue when they were married, but once they became widows, they were actually much more powerful and could sue and do all sorts of things. So she actually had 2 lawsuits, and we have the records of those lawsuits. And I actually spent time in maybe the dirtiest archive. Well, I'm not sure about that, but one of the dustiest archives I've ever been in, which was for the Chancery Court. Chancery Court was a non-criminal civil court in England until I think it closed in the 1860s. But there I found these enormous handwritten manuscripts of her petitions that she had actually showed up at the Chancery Court to sue her landlord, to sue her husband's relatives, and so on. So she was fighting. So something like that gives you a different access to her. But what we don't have for her, and we do have, for example, for Anne Clifford in spades, but also for another of the women, Elizabeth Cary, is some account of their own voice. I have no papers in Amelia Lanyer's hand, for example.
I want to actually move on to Elizabeth Cary in a moment, but I want to pick up on a moment of tension in your answer to, I think, 2 questions ago, when you were reading the poem and you said, I don't know what you think, I would call it feminist, not even proto-feminist.
Yes.
And there's this interesting anxiety, isn't there, about taking a term that feels very contemporary to us and kind of retro projecting it onto women who were writing in the 16th century. This is a problem that also, I think, afflicts, you know, I write a little bit about early modern women's pamphlets, like the kinds that Jane Eyre, for instance, wrote. So talk to me a little bit about that tension and where you might want to draw the line between like, not at all feminist, proto-feminist, and full-on feminist.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question, and I am really careful in the book about calling things feminist. In the case of Amelia Lanyer, I think with the level of attention about, so in addition to what I've read to you and explained, she also dedicated the book to 9 women, no men, and then wrote a letter to the reader that said she preferred to have only women readers. Now, this was the kind of thing that my editor wouldn't have been happy with me if I'd done such a thing, but it would have been much worse then because women were 10% of the population of women in London were literate, and we think around 3% outside of London. So this eliminated like 3/4 of her market, but she said she only wanted women to read it. So that to me feels intentionally feminist, and I think we might get away with calling it feminist, as you say. Where I don't like to use the term is, for example, with Mary Sidney, one of my other women who translated David's Psalms, all 150 Psalms, into beautiful English poetry, and always found the moment in the Psalms that represented some experience that a woman had had and brought it to life. So when, for example, the Bride of Solomon, in a sort of what should be a celebratory psalm, the Bride of Solomon is being brought to meet her new husband, Mary Sidney adds these proto-feminist lines. I don't know, I don't think they're feminists or proto-feminist in this case. I think they're just thinking about what it would feel like to be a woman being torn out of your parents' house to marry someone you've never known when you're 15. Which, guess what, is exactly what happened to her. So she found a way to kind of channel her experience. I don't see that as a feminist gesture, but I see it as one that attends to the burden of being a woman. And I think those are really different things.
Well, and I think the way, I have a feeling this question is going to recur in various guises in our conversation, but also maybe in the Q&A, but there's an interesting way that the feminist impulse feels in some ways easier to ascribe to Lanyer, in part because of her class.
That's interesting.
And I wonder actually if we could talk about Elizabeth Cary, who, I mean, if we're going kind of by reverse class ascendance,
okay, we'll go from the bottom
Cary,
up.
yeah, we'll go from the bottom up. Would Cary be the next?
Yes,
the next
absolutely,
one?
because she was born into a family with no title.
Yeah. So
So-
talk to us a little bit about how Elizabeth Cary entered into the book.
Okay, so Elizabeth Cary's claim to fame, her most extraordinary accomplishment was that she published the first original play by a woman in England. And that play, which is called The Tragedy of Miriam, the Fair Queen of Jewry, there's an interesting weird Jewish subplot going through this, tells the story of the ancient Jewish princess Miriam, who was murdered by her husband Herod, falsely accused of adultery, and was refused to obey him, refused to be quiet, refused to sleep with him. She stood by her conscience and paid the price of being murdered. She herself, Elizabeth Cary, turned out in her life, it was almost like a prophetic text, because when she wrote the text, she was a young bride. She had just either started having children, was about to bear many children, 12, in a space of 14 years, and she also made the weird decision at the time, this was really unusual, to nurse her own children. So this woman was constantly giving birth and nursing, and we know a lot about her because her 4 daughters, I should say 4 of her many daughters, who all became nuns in France, wrote her life. They wrote her life. They decided her life was worth remembering. And in that, they also describe what, again, we would diagnose as postpartum depression.
Right.
This woman was so depressed, she couldn't eat. They said she would take a little beer and bread, but she left the bread behind, so she drank a little beer. They said she lost her mind, and she was melancholic and so on. So she suffered so much. But in the play she wrote, which we think she wrote right before she started having all these children, she gives voice to this sort of radical vision of autonomy for women, not just in the figure of Miriam, but I think this is strategic, I don't know what you think, in the villain, besides Herod, who's the absolute villain, but he doesn't show up in the play till Act 4. So he's actually a pretty minor character, which I also think is kind of terrific. But Herod's sister, Salome, who we all know is a villain, makes this unbelievable speech about, she's already killed one husband and she wants to get rid of the second husband because she has a third waiting in the wings. And this one she decides she doesn't want to kill, she wants to divorce. And she makes this unbelievable, impassioned speech about how women should have the right to get divorced, which again is something that, thank you, you have it there.
Right here.
So she says, she's describing how she wants to get rid of constabarus, and she says, a separating bill might free his fate from such a yoke that did so much displease, right? He could get a separating bill, he could get a divorce. Why, she then asks, why should such privilege to man be given? Or, given to them, why barred from women? Are men than we in greater grace with heaven? Are men than we? Are men in greater grace? Does God like men better than women? Why shouldn't we have the same rights? And then she says, and I think these are just going back to your question, if this doesn't count as feminism, I don't know what does. She says, I'll be the custom breaker and begin to show my sex the way to freedom's door. And with an offering will I purge my sin. Now she shows her wickedness. The law was made for none but who are poor.
But she's the villain.
And
So
she's the villain.
Yeah, so what do we make of Elizabeth Cary giving the villain these lines?
I think she couldn't have given it to anyone else.
Right.
In other words, I think and that's the beauty of being a writer of fiction, how do you protect yourself, if you put an atheist speech in the mouth of, think about what Edmund says in King Lear, right? I mean, that you make radical speeches and then you're covered by the fact that that's the worst person in the play. But that speech is toxic to Elizabethan culture. When a couple was married and the official homily from the Church of England was read, the homily on marriage, it literally said women should be three things: chaste, obedient, and silent. So, we have two women, Miriam, who makes quite bold statements, but nothing so irreverent and immoral. But then Salome, who says these extraordinary things, and I do think that she used that character to give voice to utterances that would have gotten her in a lot of trouble.
Well, she gets into trouble for a different set of utterances
Yes.
in her life. She turns to Catholicism toward the end of her life and ends up in a cottage with a single serving lady. Her children are taken away from her.
Yeah.
But this is, of course, a marvelous opportunity to write,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yeah.
So what do you make of her turn to Catholicism and the kind of, oddly enough, paradoxically enough, maybe the freedom that
totally.
Catholicism wins her at the end?
So we probably all know people, many of us in academia certainly know people who would much rather be locked up in a cottage for the rest of their lives than going to fancy parties and getting dressed up. And we have accounts. So this woman was so nerdy as a child that her mother took away the candles so that she couldn't work at night. And then her mother-in-law, when she got married, took away her books. So she was the biggest bookworm of the entire period. Apparently, and again, this is coming from her daughters, so that's another question about but her daughters claim that by the age of 5, she spoke and had taught herself French, Italian, Spanish, and Transylvanian, because they'd had a house guest from Transylvania who she started conversing with.
Then she forgot because he left, right?
Right,
Yeah.
but she felt bad that she forgot that language.
Yeah.
Okay, her father recognized, and this is a question that we could talk about, like how did that girl get educated? She had no brothers, she was an only child, and that mattered a lot. Actually, 3 of the women in this book were in effect only children. So if there were boys to educate, that's where your resources went. But if you have this daughter who's taught herself 5 languages by the age of 5, you decide to educate her. But her father gave her, to your question about Catholicism, her father gave, this is a weird choice, but he gave her a copy of Calvin's Institutes. That's Calvin's theological work when she was 12. And not only did she read it, but she made a list of all the places where he was wrong. She disagreed with him. She hated Protestantism. I mean, as a child, she had an instinct against Protestantism. She used to refuse to go to church, and then, because it was mandatory in Protestant England that you go to church on Sunday, she was forced to go to church against her will. And then, and this is really kind of, an amazing act of defiance, when her husband, who was a impoverished aristocrat, and she was a wealthy non-aristocrat. So that's how the marriage got made between her father and this man. He needed money and the family needed a title, basically. When he became the Lord Deputy of Ireland, so he was sent up to Ireland, and his main responsibility was to put down Catholicism because there was rampant Catholic practice. She secretly started attending Catholic Mass and joined the church, and then converted to Catholicism. And then, as you say, was treated really poorly. Her husband abandoned her, basically, and refused to give her money. Her children were kidnapped from her, although she kidnapped them back. But through it all, she managed to find the peace and quiet I think she always wanted. I mean, there's a very funny anecdote in her biography of her servant chasing her around the room with a hairbrush and some jewelry because she was so busy writing and reading that she was running away from the servant. And so she didn't want to have her hair done. And we're even told, and I love this, she was apparently very small, very short. We're even told that once she got divorced, or her husband left her, she stopped having to wear her high heels, and she could just wear her comfortable clothes. So, that's who she was.
Wouldn't that be nice? What you're saying also about the historical record, about the daughters writing the autobiography, makes me think about how many of these women were writing in genres that are in various ways treated as being kind of para-literary.
Yes.
And I think
Yes.
Anne Clifford, if I'm going in
Yes.
order now to Anne Clifford, might
You're skipping a class moment.
Oh, Mary City.
But
Sorry.
we can talk about Anne
Okay.
Clifford.
Let's
I
talk
think
about
it's more
Anne Clifford
relevant.
first.
Yeah.
I think Anne Clifford is on my mind in part because we were talking about Noel and
Yes.
Zavita Sackville
Yes.
West. But Anne Clifford writes an autobiography, right? The autobiography of me.
The Life of Me.
The Life of Me.
Yeah, that's her title.
The Life of Me. The Life of Me.
I gotta love that.
The Life of Me. And even today, we do tend to think, or there's a school of thought that would dismiss personal writing,
Totally.
autobiographical, memoirish writing, as being somehow lesser than
Yeah.
properly imaginative literary fiction. Talk to us about Anne Clifford and how
Yeah.
she has the courage, because I think that's it, to write The Life of Me.
Yeah. So Anne Clifford might be my favorite of the
Yeah.
four women. You also?
Yeah, me too.
She's a really fascinating character. She started keeping a diary in 1603 when she was 13 years old, and she actually begins her diary with the death of Queen Elizabeth and the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, which she attended but wasn't allowed to officially participate in because she was too small. Her mother was marching and taking care of the corpse for a month, the rotting corpse of Queen Elizabeth, because it wasn't wrapped properly, so this was not an easy job. Anyway, she started her diary in 1603, and she ended it in 1676. So first of all, she lived to 86, which is amazing. The day before she died, she had inscribed by her secretary, she couldn't write anymore, her final entry in the diary is, "Thank God I am so well." Anyway, between 1603 and 1676, we have not by any means all of the diaries. We have a weird, to your point, a weird combination of records. In addition to that, she wrote a standalone memoir called The Life of Me, which doesn't begin with her birth, it begins with her conception. She actually pinpoints the day, and she has that moment painted, in fact. So this is a woman who thought her own life mattered and who kept lots of track of it. What motivated her for much of that, at least for the first 40 years, was that she was fighting a lawsuit. And that was really driving her to keep track of everything that was happening to her. So when she was 15, she was disinherited from, probably next to the crown, the largest estates in the country. Her father was the Earl of Cumberland. He owned 90,000 acres in the north of England, many, many castles. She was an only child, or she had had a brother. There were two boys, but one died before she was born, one died soon after, so she was an only child. And her father decided to pass the property to his brother so that it would stay in the male line. Now, For everyone who's read Jane Austen and watched Downton Abbey, that might sound perfectly normal, but actually primogeniture didn't apply to this family. A special law had been passed in the 14th century because this was such a massive property. The king had passed a law, an entail, that said the Clifford land should go to the direct heir regardless of sex. So she legally had the upper hand. She should have inherited that land. And she fought for 38 years. She fought a lawsuit. And this lawsuit was intense. At one point, she finds herself literally locked up in King James's presence chamber with the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a whole team of men, forcing her to sign a cash buyout, basically. They wanted to buy her out. They were offering her a lot of money, and she stood her ground and refused. And she was punished. Her husband kidnapped the daughter. He wouldn't sleep with her. And how do I know that? Because she tells us that. So this diary, to your point about the literary angle, this isn't the kind of high literature that, that Virginia Woolf respected. And Virginia Woolf is actually pretty obnoxious about Anne Clifford and says, she ate mutton and good English cheese and, but Vida Sackville-West, Virginia Woolf's lover, actually admired Anne Clifford quite a bit and was directly related to Anne Clifford's husband. So Anne Clifford's first husband was named Richard Sackville. His family home was Knowle House. That's where Vida grew up and was herself disinherited from. And Anne Clifford lived at Knowle, and Vida actually found her diary, or was given a manuscript of her diary there, and published it in 1923. So there's a kind of Bloomsbury weird echo here of Vida Sackville-West publishing the diary, Virginia Woolf insulting her and not recognizing her. She knew about her, but precisely she didn't count. And I do think this question, and it's a bigger one, Merve, and I don't know if you've encountered this when you teach any of the material you've been describing, but of, what gets to count as literature? And if we only go by the standards of the new critics in the early 20th century and, stick with the English canon, then, we lose out on all of these other voices who are giving us lots of things, and it might not be the exact same things as John Donne.
Well, is it Anne Clifford's father who also has the scheme for her to marry William Cavendish? And,
yes.
Right. And so that was like this amazing counterfactual moment for me, where I was like, what if Anne Clifford had married William Cavendish and he hadn't married Margaret Cavendish? Where would the kind of history of early modern women's writing
Yes,
be
and for
now?
people in the audience who don't know, Margaret Cavendish was an extraordinary, Margaret Cavendish, that's her married name, sort of a generation younger than Anne Clifford, but who was an amazing writer and also philosopher.
Right, and someone who Woolf also duly insults
Yes.
in the
Right.
Common Reader.
That's right.
In the Common Reader, and also in A Room of One's Own. And so there's something very kind of interesting here about the modernists working out
Totally.
this kind of long history of resentment, I think in part of the aristocracy,
Yes.
in addition to resentment of genres that might not be considered
Yes,
properly
absolutely.
literary. So, okay, I realize I skipped one.
Okay.
So do you want to take us to our fourth and
Yeah.
final woman?
Who's actually the oldest.
Right.
So she's more where the book starts. But the fourth, so we have Amelia Lanyer, who was the daughter of the Italian, possibly Jewish immigrant, who's a poet. We have Elizabeth Cary, who's the daughter of a very wealthy lawyer, who's the playwright. We have Anne Clifford, who's a fabulous diarist and memoir writer. And then we have Mary Sidney, who is probably the only one who maybe people might ever have read in terms of her reputation preceding the last 20 or 30 years, but that's only because she had a really famous literary brother. So her brother, Sir Philip Sidney, was the first poet in England to write a major sonnet series in the style of Petrarch, and also wrote the first long prose romance in English called the Arcadia, but the full title is The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, and the Countess of Pembroke is Mary Sidney, his sister, with whom he wrote it, and she was very involved in that process. Mary Sidney was married off at the age of 15 to a much older man who'd been married twice before and really needed a son. So he chose this young woman, and within a couple years, she had given him 2 sons. And at that point, he seems to have let her do what she wanted to do. So I would say of the 4 marriages, I mean, 2 were total train wrecks and divorce, basically divorce. I would say in a funny way, that was the best, the most enabling marriage, because they lived in a big, big, beautiful house with 200 rooms, Wilton House.
Who wouldn't have a good marriage? They had 199 rooms of one's own.
Yeah, exactly. And she, when her brother died, her famous literary brother, he died fighting for the Protestants in the Netherlands, and he died from a battle wound against the Spanish. She started her literary life actually really by entering through his career. She published all of his works. She edited them and published them. They'd never been published because he was one of these sort of gentleman, courtier, aristocrat poets who thought it would be beneath him, what we call the stigma of print, that it was dirtying to publish your works. But she went ahead and published them. And then she started to write things of her own. And her most extraordinary accomplishment, which I referred to briefly before, was that Philip had translated the first 43 Psalms into beautiful English poetry. He had actually just drafted them, they weren't finished. And then she picked up his work, she polished off the 43 that he'd done, and then translated the remaining 107. And if you needed an introduction to the extraordinary variety and complexity and beauty of Renaissance English poetry, this would be a really good primer. It's amazing. She used 128 different rhyme schemes. So she was a virtuosity. She had virtuosity as a poet, and she was really committed to kind of completing this task. She also wrote original poetry. She did other translations, which she published with her name on the title page, 2 translations from French, one of a play and one of a philosophical treatise on death. She was really, an incredibly gifted poet and was recognized pretty widely at the time. People dedicated works to her. They sang her praises in all sorts of ways. But interestingly, and not that surprisingly, that book of Psalms, which wasn't published at the time, became Philip's work. And it was published under his name. Only he was given credit for it. For hundreds of years, her role in that was erased, even though John Donne, one of the great poets of the era, wrote a long poem praising her translation of the Psalms. So that's another question that I've been thinking a lot about, is what happened when these women were reasonably well known during their own time, but 60 years later, the record had been adjusted, and so they've been erased.
Right, and the move to ascribe something that a woman has written to her brother, her husband, her father was such a typical move at that time, and such an insidious practice of erasure. There's a 5th woman in this book, and you do something that I so admire, that I think is so difficult for most ensemble biographers to do, which is you get all 4 of your characters in the same place at the same time. And this happens at the very beginning of the book, and it's at Queen Elizabeth's funeral.
Yeah.
And I again, can't tell you how much I admire this, because there are so many ensemble biographies that one reads where you're like, what on earth do these people have anything to do with each other? But there is some remarkable scene setting in that first chapter, in addition to something you alluded to, which is your description of Queen Elizabeth's kind of rotting corpse, right? And the smell of it and the sight of it. So Queen Elizabeth does seem to circulate throughout the book as a 5th woman. And I was thinking as I was reading about how royalty, right, the royal family, comes bearing a tremendous archive with them, right? There's a great deal that we can extract from their historical records. And what an interesting tension it is in this book, that 5th woman kind of orbiting these other women is the most well documented of the 5 of them. So just talk a little bit about Queen Elizabeth in the background.
Yeah, and I don't know what you would say, Merve, but I'd say there's a 6th woman, which is Queen Anne. Queen Anne of Denmark, so King James's wife, whom they all also knew, and at least 3 of them were involved in her masques and her funeral. And it is really interesting. But about Queen Elizabeth, I decided to start the book with Queen Elizabeth initially because I realized that Anne Clifford had begun this lifelong project of writing a diary there. And in her first entry, in her first diary, she talks about old Lady Pembroke also being at the funeral, and that's Mary Sidney. So I had two down.
Right.
And then I realized, oh, Amelia Lanyer, and I actually realized this by literally being in the rare books and manuscripts room at the British Library, where they have a roll, and I mean a roll, like I could roll it from here almost to the front of the store, of drawings of the procession for Queen Elizabeth's funeral. I have one image of this in the book, or maybe two, but it shows everyone who was there, and this was done in 1603. So someone who witnessed it and looked at the rolls wrote down who was there and what the order was, and I realized that, although he wasn't named, because of course he wouldn't be named, but that all of the court musicians were there. And then I realized, by looking at the payment rolls, to your point, you know, everything is recorded at this funeral, I realized that Amelia Lanyer's husband, Alfonso Lanyer, the recorder player, received X amount of black cloth for his outfit for the funeral. So there he was named. Every person who participated got special black cloth. And depending on your place in the social hierarchy, you got beautiful velvets or cheap nylon, whatever it was, but you got black cloth. So then I realized that he was there, and then I realized that Elizabeth Cary's husband was there, named because he was keeper of the jewel house. So I thought, well, if my husband were marching in Queen Elizabeth's funeral, I would probably want to come. So I don't lie, and we could talk about a lot of things, but one thing about writing nonfiction as opposed to fiction, I would have loved to make it up and say that they were all there, but I can't do that. But I've got two women there, and I have two women whose husbands are there, and this is the biggest event ever in the last, I mean, she'd been queen for so long, and so I imagine Amelia Lanyer and Elizabeth Cary in the crowds in London. But I also start the book there, and you're absolutely right that she's really a strong character, and Queen Anna is in a different way, because I think she was such a mixed example for these women. So on the one hand, she was the so-called virgin queen, even though she definitely wasn't a virgin, but she was called the virgin queen. She never married. She said she was married to her country, and she made very disparaging comments about being a woman. She said, you know, I might have the body of a woman, but I have the heart and soul of a man. She hated when her women at court got married and would try to convince them not to. So she wasn't an ordinary example of what it meant to be a woman in Renaissance England. On the other hand, she was a great scholar and thinker. She was a writer. She had an extraordinary education, which, as you say, was very well documented. So her tutor, Roger Askin, wrote a whole book, The Schoolmaster, about pedagogy in England, and he calls her out as his best student, and he says, all of you, men at Oxford and Cambridge should be ashamed of yourself because she could translate from Latin and Greek better than any of you. So this is the queen. She then went on to publish a few works of her own, of prayers, of meditations. She wrote poetry. So what an amazing thing for women of the period to have her as their queen. And how did that impact these women? And did it inspire them? How much were they aware of that? All of these, I think, are important questions. So it's both a centralizing moment, but I think it's the sort of launching moment for thinking about what it meant to try to be a writer in the period.
I have one last question, and it'll take us back to Woolf momentarily, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for questions, so get your questions ready, please. One of the arguments that Woolf makes in A Room of One's Own is that even the women who did write, their writing was deformed by their consciousness of themselves as women. And so they were railing against men, and she takes that deformity really all the way up to Charlotte Bronte.
Yeah.
She finds it in Jane Eyre. Austen is exempt from it because of the marvelous shape of her sentences. Emily Bronte to a certain extent too. But there's a sense in your book that in fact it is precisely the hardship and the impossibility of writing as a woman that makes these women's verses interesting, that makes their work interesting. It's not that it's free of any gender
Yeah.
consciousness. It's that they found a way to express that gender consciousness and to do it in these really interesting, really compelling forms and genres. Oh, my timer is just went off. So how do we think about the role of women's anger and its relationship to aesthetics, to whether it makes a work, to be very crude about it, good or bad, whether the work gives us pleasure or causes displeasure in us?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. It has everything to do with canonicity and the canon and what counts as high literature. And certainly Woolf didn't have any taste for what these women were writing, what's in this book, and as you say, she took it very far. You know, I agree with your characterization of the writing. I do think that it's certainly not in spite of, and I would say it's only really because of there being women that they were able to do this, that they had the urge to do it. I think, look, women didn't go to school, as I said, they couldn't go to university, they had no option of any professional life, but they could write. They had an access to writing if they could. And so we get access to what their experiences were and how they lived in this world that we otherwise see only from men. It doesn't dominate all of their writing, but it makes that writing, you know, I think what it is, and it makes it interesting. And I think we've lost so much, like in the last, you know, now in the last 20 or 30 years, we've started to recover it. But, you know, still today at most of our universities, these women writers, and from slightly later periods, you know, not when we get to the novel maybe, they're still only taught in women's writing classes. So, you know, why aren't we reading Amelia Lanyer next to Herbert and Donne and so on? I mean, to the other religious writers. Why aren't we reading Elizabeth Cary next to Shakespeare? And whether you like Shakespeare or Elizabeth Cary better, you know, I mean, Shakespeare, you know, is the most extraordinary writer I think ever, and I'm not going to start weighing these authors on aesthetic grounds. But I think this cordoning off, as if it's the way certain artifacts get put in ethnography museums, but not in art museums. And you know, I think we're starting to break those barriers down, but I think they need to be broken down.
Audience, questions from you? Yes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my question actually comes out of the beginning of your talk, Ramie, when you were talking about Amelia Lanyer and her book of poetry, which was dedicated to a group of women and intended for women. So could you talk about whether she and these other women had women that they were able to share their work with at the time?
Well, yeah, that's such a great question. And one of the most sort of powerful moments among that group of dedications is the poem she writes to Mary Sidney. And in that poem, which she frames as a dream vision, she imagines Mary Sidney, who is not that much older than her, actually, I think 8 years older than her in terms of birth, but was the sort of grande dame of, you know, English letters, and had published and had the famous, you know, brother, and so was an aristocrat. And she imagines Mary Sidney reading the book of poems that she's written, Amelia's poems, and approving of them and sort of passing the mantle. We start to see what it could have looked like to create a female canon. You know, we have Mary Sidney reading Amelia Lanyer and approving of these poems. We have then 2 years later, Elizabeth Cary publishing The Tragedy of Miriam, right after Amelia Lanyer. So you get this kind of underground, unarticulated network, but it's not nearly so direct as, you know, Wordsworth imitating Milton and Milton imitating Spencer. And so it's not that. In terms of the readership though, which I think is part of your question, what didn't happen with Amelia Lanyer's book of poems was that any of those women she dedicated to offered her a job, a place in her household. She actually is sort of asking on multiple occasions. We don't have any sense that anyone picked up on this. And so, you know, was it, back to Merve's point about, you know, this feminist work, was it were they not ready for that work? Why didn't it succeed? We know she actually handed out sample copies to people. We have 2 examples of them where she actually wrote different kinds of included some and not others. So she was clearly trying to get a group of, like a reading group, a group of women who would read her poems, but there's no evidence that it happened.
She couldn't get a patron, but also, I'm just wondering, I can't remember if you talk about this. Were there instances in your book of when a woman would publish something or try to print something or circulate something and people would accuse her of being crazy?
No.
No. Okay.
No, so that didn't happen. I mean, what did happen in several cases, as you alluded to, is that people contested that such a thing could have been really written by a woman. Even to the level of, there's a hilarious moment when Elizabeth Cary wrote this very long, really interesting history of King Edward II, and it got published after her death. And she even wrote a preface to it saying this was like the work of my weary pen, and she signed it Elizabeth Cary. And it got published, and the publisher assigned it to her husband because they found it in her husband's closet. Anyway, the husband never wrote a thing in his life. And then the preface that the publisher said, like, what a fine example of manly writing. That was what was drawn out. So, even at that level, they weren't being acknowledged, but they weren't, to Woolf's point, no one was accusing them
of being witches babbling in the countryside.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Come on, audience.
So thank you, that was a terrific conversation, and I can't wait to read the book. At one point you mentioned a play, I can't remember whose it was.
Yeah, Elizabeth Cary's Tragic Mary.
Was it ever performed? Were there, I guess it's a similar question,
Yeah.
What was the chance of actually getting this work out in the world? And if there were other plays, are there examples of their performance?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So I don't know if you or other audience members are all familiar with this category, but it was written as a so-called closet drama, meaning that it would be read privately in people's living rooms, but not. She didn't intend it to be performed. And the same thing is true. Mary Sidney translated, I mentioned that she translated a play from French, and that play is called Antinous. It's the story of Mark Antony, and it's really the story of Cleopatra. And it was one of Shakespeare's sources for Antony and Cleopatra. Very clearly, it was written around 16 years before that. Both of those were closet dramas. So not meant for the stage. And there was a whole aesthetic hierarchy that closet dramas were more literary, that they were for refined taste, whereas the public theater was just a kind of bear baiting, like a football game. So it was not performed. And it's also striking that that play also was written in 1613, published in 1613, excuse me, and didn't reappear in print until the 1990s. So that's another question, is these things didn't take off, even though they were published. There's a couple of hands over here.
Do you think, had these women written when Elizabeth was on the throne, if they had written roughly a century before, if they would have been received differently? Because Elizabeth was staggeringly well educated. Most people don't realize just how smart she was.
That's absolutely right.
Smart and how she managed to stay alive and actually end up with the throne. But suppose she had been queen and they were writing when she was on the throne, do you think the whole thing would have been different?
I mean, first of all, to your point, she was extraordinarily well educated. Mary Sidney actually did publish during Queen Elizabeth's lifetime. So Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and then 2 of these publications were a decade later, 1611 and 1613. But Mary Sidney's publication of her French play and of her other translation from French, was actually in 1592. And she also wrote a long, beautiful poem to Queen Elizabeth and prepared for her a manuscript of her Psalms. So there was a direct sort of exchange going on between Elizabeth and Mary Sidney. As I said before, Queen Elizabeth was no great fan of women. I mean, that she didn't ever start a school. She didn't encourage women in any way that we know about. So.
Well, except she would have no one around her, no woman around her unless they were literate.
Oh yeah, no. She liked being surrounded by literate people. So I guess I would point out that Queen Anna of Denmark, who really doesn't get the attention she deserves, was much more supportive of women than Queen Elizabeth, and created a whole world of female performance in her masks that were only done by women. So I do think that there was a quite encouraging culture in the 17th century too. I think there was a couple of hands up.
We have time for one or two more. So.
I'm having this futuristic moment where I'm thinking like 425 years from now, who will write the book about the 4 women that were present at the last Queen Elizabeth's funeral? And will they all just be like TikTok artists, right? It's like Shakespeare's TikTok. Yeah, go ahead. Who do we have?
My question was, I finished the book later last week. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. The question I would have is that, particularly with Anne Clifford, she had a mother that really championed her rights to her territory, to her inheritance. Would you say that? So she would have been with a woman who's very forward-thinking. She was really emancipated and really working towards making sure her daughter got what was due to her. Would you, in your research, did you find? I mean, I don't think Elizabeth Cary had that with her own mother.
No, you're
but
absolutely
did any of the other women in the book have similar? Maybe not their mother, maybe an aunt, maybe another person that they were working with. That would have championed their own literature, their own work, their own rise through society?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And the best known book about women's education by the Spanish humanist Juan Vives said, like, it's up to the mother to educate the daughter, right? That's the only place you're gonna get educated. And Anne Clifford's mother, she had only one child, and she devoted herself, as you say, to teaching her. And then it seems like when she kind of ran out of steam homeschooling her, she brought in Samuel Daniel, one of the great poets of the era and historians, to teach her daughter. So she actually hired tutors. Mary Sidney's mother, Lady Sidney, was super well educated herself. Her own mother, so Mary Sidney's grandmother, was one of the women at the court of Henry VIII, and she was known for her scholarly devotion to Protestantism and for speaking beautiful French and Italian. So we had 3 generations of super educated women. And when we look at the records, a lot of what, to get back to the evidence question, a lot of what I could learn about these women came from payment rolls. And when we look at who was getting paid in the Sidney household, we have tutors just for the girls. You know, so that means people were coming out. There was Mr. Lodovic, the Italian teacher. There was, you know, they named them. So her mother had a pretty demanding job as one of the Queen's ladies of the Privy Chamber, so she wasn't home teaching Mary Sidney herself. But I think your bigger point is so important, that really the only chance you had of getting educated was if your parents, and very often your mother, wanted you to be. Elizabeth Cary is the funny example because she's the one whose mother was taking away the candles. And not only doing that, but also forging letters to her new husband because she was so afraid that the husband was going to be intimidated by how intelligent she was. So, you know, that was not a supportive mother.
I love that detail. I think what we've learned tonight is that if as a woman you want to be remembered, you have to sue lots of people.
Yeah,
lots of lawsuits, yeah.
Suing
Lots of
is
lawsuits.
good. There was one other hand in the back. I don't know if you want to have one last question.
Thank you very much. I have one question from working on an earlier, on the earlier period, the Middle Ages and even antiquity, where whenever we meet a woman who's actually writing, she says, although I'm a little woman, like we have the topos of humility, and it is a topos. The woman has to do it. And so, I mean, even the great Heloise, you know, the lover of Abelard. So, do you find that topos in your women? I came in later, maybe that was your first discussion.
No, it's a very good question. Not in all of them, but Elizabeth Cary, which kind of disappointed me, does it quite often. Apologizes for her sex despite the weakness of my sex I'm writing. Amelia Lanyer doesn't do that, which is interesting. Mary Sidney doesn't do it, but in general, you're absolutely right, and unfortunately it persists. And it's also the case that translation was considered a sort of softer entry point into being an author. So it's not a coincidence that women often began by translating, because you could say, I'm just channeling the men, I'm just bringing their work into the world. But it's a topos that persists, absolutely.
Ramie, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank